Welcome to the third talk in our Climate Conversations series. It's called Keeping History Above Water, presented by Margaret Back. It's great to see so many of you again. I see some new faces as well as some people who have been here for the last couple of talks. For anybody who's new, just a little overview. This is a series of programming that has three components to it. These lecture series, which there are four in this series, and there's one more next week on Thursday. The exhibit of community photographs in the hallway area here along the gallery wall. Those are all photographs contributed by community members, illustrating the changes that the climate change has had in the community. And a lot of those photos can be found on a website called My Coast, which is a place that anybody can go and view photos from around the state to see how climate change has been documented, the effects of climate change there. And we also have a book display out near the fiction section in the main part of the library with lots of great titles on climate change, books for kids, books for adults, books to help you know what to do, what actions you can take in the future to fight climate change. And there's also a book list there and on the Climate Conversations website. All right, so this whole project has been a community-driven thing. The community has come together to put this programming together, and if you'd like to be a part of that community and to know about future actions and what you can do in the future, we recommend you to sign your contact information on some sign-up sheets that are going to be passed around. If you signed up last week or the week before, you don't need to sign again, but we do want to keep the momentum from these programs going, and because this is an ongoing issue, it's going to be with us for a long time. We got to stay vigilant and do what we can. All right. And this programming is sponsored by the Friends of the North Kingstown Free Library. That is a group that does a ton throughout the year to support programming at the library. They do a lot to raise money for the library so we can have great programs like this and new supplies in the library. They do so much for us. And anybody can become a member of that group. There's information at the back table there about how to become a member. We encourage you to do so because it's really vital to keeping the library going to be a great library for this community. So you'll notice there's a couple of cameras set up here. We are recording these talks. The talk last week was recorded and it just got posted to the library's YouTube page today. So encourage you all to go check that out if you weren't able to see it last week. This one will also be posted in about a week or so, and next week's talk will be recorded as well. After Margaret's presentation, there will be a Q&A session, and this week I have a microphone I'm going to bring to the people who ask the question. So just keep in mind, if you don't want to be filmed or on camera, just please let us know about it, and we can edit you out of it or whatever. And yeah, I think that's all the preamble I have to do tonight. And so tonight's talk is called Keeping History Above Water, and is presented by Margaret Back. Margaret Back is a preservation projects manager at the Newport Restoration Foundation. At the NRF, Margaret leads projects connecting climate change and built heritage resiliency for the organization's nearly 80 colonial properties. Her current projects include an energy efficiency study for the 19th century Newport buildings, and she is the project lead for Keeping History Above Water, the Keeping History Above Water initiative. She has previously worked as a preservation manager for the South region of historic New England. She holds an MS in historic preservation from the University of Pennsylvania. Please welcome Margaret Back.
Hello, how is everyone? So my name's Margaret. I'm here tonight from the Newport Restoration Foundation to talk about one of our core initiatives with you all, which is the Keeping History Above Water initiative. And I'm really just thrilled to be presenting tonight in Wickford. Me and my colleagues have given versions of this presentation in the past around the country, and it's nice to be with a hometown audience who will have actually been to Newport. I hope all of you have been to Newport and will actually know some of the places that I'm referencing tonight. Pull my notes out. So the Keeping History Above Water conference series was founded in 2016 to be a multidisciplinary conversation about the effects of sea level rise on cultural resources, particularly our heritage along the coast. Over the last 8 years, we've hosted 11 Keeping History Above Water conferences and events across the United States. We were really excited last year to host our first International Keeping History Above Water conference in Trinidad and Tobago. I'm getting louder. And these different types of programs can be in the form of conferences, events, programs, really quite flexible. But before I jump too far into Keeping History Above Water, I just want to give a little overview of the Newport Restoration Foundation, how our organization came to found a conversation about climate change and sea level rise. So the Newport Restoration Foundation was founded in 1968 by Doris Duke, philanthropist and heiress, really to protect the cultural resources and historic heritage of historic Newport. And really, Ms. Duke's main tool in accomplishing this was by purchasing over 100 colonial-era properties across the city of Newport and restoring them. This was all done in the 60s and 70s. Today, NRF owns about 80 of these properties. The majority of them are lived in by year-round tenant stewards, and they're maintained by our full-time crew of preservation painters and carpenters. In addition to this work, we also have 3 public sites that are open almost year-round. We have the Vernon House in the lower left here, which is really used as a preservation learning lab in the heart of downtown Newport on Clark Street. We also have Rough Point Museum that you can see on the upper left, the home of Doris Duke. And it's really important to us at NRF that we actively use our public sites. They're not just places you can tour and visit, but they're also places to have active conversations, of course, about the life and legacy of Doris Duke, about historic preservation, about historic preservation trades, and also about climate change. But what's also really significant about our properties, particularly to myself, is we learned a few years ago that about half of our portfolio of properties, closely about 32 buildings, are currently located in the FEMA-designated flood zone, or they will be located within the flood zone with an additional 3 to 5 feet of sea level rise, which we know is coming. So we know that our properties only represent a handful of historic homes, both here in Rhode Island and across the country, but we know as well that they're located in one of the densest, most historic colonial neighborhood in America, and that the choices we make with our portfolio of vulnerable properties will not only affect our own portfolio, but also our neighbors and larger scale neighborhoods. So we knew when we found this information about the vulnerability of so many of our public sites and homes to many tenants that we needed to have a larger conversation about the effects of climate change on cultural resources. So in 2016, Keeping History Above Water really was founded, I think, as a lot of conversations and conferences are around a specific site in a specific place. In this case, it was 74 Bridge Street in Newport. 74 Bridge Street is located in the historic Point neighborhood, waterfront neighborhood. It's one of the oldest neighborhoods, not only in the city of Newport, but in the country. It was laid out, I should say, around 1709 by the Quaker community. It's a very dense urban neighborhood as well. Prior to the Revolutionary War, it was really known for being a community of artisans, of shipwrights. 74 Bridge Street is also known as the Christopher Townsend House for its association with the Townsend family of furniture makers. And following the Revolutionary War, a lot of this area turned industrial. The cove that you can see pictured in the lower image there, very close to where 74 Bridge Street is located, ended up being filled in about 10 years after this map with the railroad, which brought a lot of industry and commercialization to Newport. Today, that area of Newport remains filled in, as you can see in the upper right, map there. It has active docks and marinas and a bus depot. But yet it also remains one of the lowest lying points in the city of Newport, very close to this historic neighborhood. And because of that location, even though it's not directly on the waterfront, Bridge Street sees some of the most significant flooding in the city. You can see not only in superstorm events like Superstorm Sandy, major hurricane events, but also just with high tide flooding events that you can see just from this past 2 winters. We do see flooding in this neighborhood whenever there's high tides and significant rainfall or melting snow as well. And we know this is not going to change anytime soon. Over the next 25 years, the projected high tide flood days in this neighborhood are only going to increase. I should have outlined where Bridge Street is, but it's basically in the middle of that most colorful region of the map here. And this isn't a new trend in Rhode Island. We know that by 2100, we're expected to have at least 9 feet of sea level rise in certain areas of the state, and we know that rainfall events have been increasing about an inch every 10 years, and certainly we've all been seeing how storm events have become more threatening and strong as well. I also just want to step back and show you the larger historic district within Newport. Outlined in the top there is the Point neighborhood that I've been talking about. And certainly it's one of the 6 historic district neighborhoods in Newport, which are outlined in that dark blue color, which stands out pretty well here on the projector. But it's only one neighborhood, and you can see there are a number of neighborhoods in Newport, historic neighborhoods I should note, that are going to be threatened by climate change in different ways in the future. Much of Newport is also historic, although tonight I'm mostly going to be talking about neighborhoods that are within historic districts. I also just want to note that a huge number of the housing stock in Newport, and of course throughout Rhode Island, and particularly coastal Rhode Island, has a number of historic, to our hearts I should say, older buildings that may not be located in historic districts, but are certainly subject to flooding and some of the conditions that we'll be looking at tonight. So I just want to say that even though historic districts are often the ones more advertised, they're the ones who can often get more funding, we're very much interested in Newport in protecting all forms of older buildings, both for their value architecturally, as housing, their environmental sustainability, and the value that they have for the people who own them. So back to 74 Bridge Street. This property, we knew we needed to have a larger conversation, and we hoped that 74 Bridge Street could act as a type of really litmus test here for other historic homes in not only the Point neighborhood, but across Newport and Rhode Island to talk about this issue of sea level rise. So in 2016, NRF held the first Keeping History Above Water conference. It was a 4-day conference hosted in Newport. And it really explored a number of different U.S. case studies on adaptation. We looked to international best precedents as well, structural adaptation, disaster planning. It was a really wide-ranging conversation. And part of this was because we recognized at the onset that a room of historic preservationists talking to each other about what to do with historic resources in the flood zone wouldn't get us too far. We needed to engage architects and engineers, city planners, but also community members, students, anyone who was interested and had a stake in this topic, which I think is probably everyone here in this room tonight as well, about what to do with our cultural heritage located along the coast. The conference also served as a really useful means to talk further about 74 Bridge Street and what to do. One panel specifically looked at mitigation and adaptation solutions for this site. Do we elevate 74 Bridge Street? Do we pick it up and set it back a few feet on a higher plane? Do we relocate it entirely out of the city of Newport? Do we flood-proof the building to keep water from entering the basement, or wet-proof to allow water to flow freely during high tide events? Ignoring funding, we explored all different types of possible solutions in a charrette exercise. And what really came out of this, I think, was the acknowledgement that solutions would require more than just the homeowner, more than just the city or the municipality, but everyone really working together. I know it sounds a little dorky, but it's true. I think in order to have a really relevant conversation, you need to have all these players at the table. You need to know not only what you can do at a site level to mitigate your stormwater, but what your city's doing. Do you have a tidal gate going in at the end of your street? That's helpful to know. And also with policy and design, what are the type of ordinances or overlays that might affect your home or community, that might limit the types of adaptations that you can do on your own property? So we knew that we needed to have many people in the room to have these conversations. So we also knew following that event that the conversation wasn't going to stop in Newport. There were a lot of people who came to the first Keeping History Above Water from outside of Rhode Island or Newport and wanted to bring a similar conversation home to their host community. So as I mentioned, we've hosted now 11 conferences, programs across the country over the last 8 years. Most recently, we just got back in June from Honolulu for Keeping History Above Water Pacific, which looked at island nations. And we also had our first international conference last year in Trinidad and Tobago. So we've really been happy that the momentum has really just continued on its own. One of the things that we really like about Keeping History Above Water is that it's very much been a grassroots effort. Host communities have actually reached out to us at NRF interested in hosting a conference. We haven't had to do too much soul-seeking into coastal communities to find folks who wanted to bring these conversations home with them. And we've been able to host so many, and we hope to continue to do so because of this momentum and these great networks that we've been able to pull together through the conference series. Some of the things that I think make the perfect ingredients for a Keeping History Above Water conference, to me, it's what I mentioned before, that municipal community involvement, but also having federal representation. We'll often be in the room with folks who say, but I don't know how high I can elevate my home. I don't know what I'm allowed to do. And there's usually someone from FEMA there or someone from the Park Service there who can actually weigh in on those topics and be in the room to have those conversations directly. Again, there's a great network that come from these events. Certainly the types of solutions that would be good for us here in Rhode Island and Newport and Wickford may not be the same as those in Honolulu, but the fact that we can have the conversations, have experts in the room, you now have someone you can call or reach out to, you have a new network that you can connect to, experts who work in this field and can talk about what's going on in your community with you. And I really think having a theme and different case studies about not only what's working in your home community, but also about other cases that have been working well elsewhere that you can showcase and maybe even carry through other events have been really successful in the past. I'm going to just quickly walk through a couple of past conferences. I know no one wants to look at a picture of people sitting in a room watching someone present, like a picture in the back of this room, so I'm going to try to just show a couple of case studies from these past conferences and try to bring them to light a little. The first I just want to highlight is actually less of a case study and more of a point about these conferences and how they've grown through the years. Keeping History Above Water, Annapolis, Maryland in 2017 was the first conference after Newport. They did this really interesting activity called a graphic recording, where after each session they actually sketched out the conversations that were had. And I was looking back at this the other day and realized we've come very far in terms of climate science and having to make that case to people. I was looking at this graphic here, and Jeff Goodell was the speaker who writes a lot about climate change. There was a lot about how do we get the word out on social media about climate change being real. And I think there's less of that now, especially in the last conference we attended in Honolulu. No one was trying to make the case that climate change was real. Even if you don't want to use the words climate change, we see flooding. We see what just happened in Florida with Helene and now Milton. I don't think the case needs to be made anymore that flooding is affecting our community. So it's great to see that in only 8 years we have less to prove at these conferences and can really dig into the meat, I would say. A few years later in Nantucket, I think this is a great case study to show these conferences have been a great way to highlight climate science as well and the ways that we've been able to move forward documentation of historic places. This is a visualization of sea level rise that was actually done by the University of Florida, and it captures a main street in Nantucket using point cloud technology. And this is an area that is going to only see more flooding. I should know what in Nantucket they're planning to do with this area, whether it's to fortify or something else. But this is a beautiful way to have a snapshot in time of this property and to document changes that we're going to be seeing in our lifetimes. Norfolk in 2022 had some really great conversations about testing the flood resilience of traditional materials. And I highlight that here. We went on a couple of walking tours of neighborhoods that are really low-lying, like the image on the right. And Norfolk's quite different than what we see here in Newport or in other coastal communities. They really have tidal flooding on a fairly regular basis. Several days a week, the similar areas in town will experiencing flooding. And because of that, the Park Service has been working actively over the last few years, as have local groups in Virginia and otherwise, to actually test materials and to see that maybe your house will flood, but only for an hour or two, once a week or once a month. Structurally, is it safe? Can those materials withstand flooding over time? Do you have tile on your first floor? Do you have carpeting? And they're doing a lot of research into this in order to preserve materials in houses rather than every time a storm comes through, as we're seeing your insurance rates go up, your house gets gutted out and has to be replaced with drywall. We would hate to see that in older buildings. So this type of testing that's going on in Virginia has been really interesting with the Park Service and others, and certainly something to follow. I also point out in Norfolk, this was a really interesting presentation that the municipality there gave the city of Norfolk on flooding and mapping. For any of you who use Google Maps or Waze in particular, this is a service called Flood Map that the city is actually integrating with, and it provides drivers, as they drive through flooded neighborhoods and streets like this one here outside the Art Museum in Norfolk, they can actually drop tags saying this street is flooding, and it'll redirect drivers to not go down that. I think this is the kind of really sensitive and thoughtful types of adaptations we need to be thinking about that Google can be doing, that other people can be doing, and it's really great to see Norfolk really advancing that strategies into our daily lives. I mentioned Trinidad and Tobago in 2023. This was a really interesting push for us with the conference series. This was hosted both by the National Trust of Trinidad and Tobago as well as the U.S. Department of State. And I think why it was interesting is we know that islands are often on the forefront of climate stress. So being able to see the types of effects to island nations and communities are quite different than what we might see in a coastal community with different resources. Trinidad and Tobago really had a focus as well on Trinidadians, particularly youth, at passing along local knowledge, awareness, and customs within that. I was really impressed at this conference, which I will also say is our first live stream conference. You can go on YouTube and actually watch this yourself. Coastal conversation and natural resource protection was much more spoken of in this than built architectural heritage. And that was, I think, one of the earlier conferences that did this. It was thinking about how more sustainable activities in the long run, such as building up your shoreline protection, can often be less expensive than gray infrastructure like seawalls, and ultimately much more healthy for your communities as well. And then, I'm sorry, there is actually a picture here of a boring conference room, but Portsmouth last year as well, Keeping History Above Water in New Hampshire. This was held as part of the city's 400th anniversary celebration. It followed the conference theme, Water Has a Memory. And for anyone who's been to Portsmouth, I hope most of you, and visited Strawberry Bank, that's actually one of the lowest lying points in the city of Portsmouth. And that Outdoor History Museum's just been doing a lot of really great efforts to advocate for their historic architecture, as well as the city of Portsmouth, who are our co-partners on this conference. Topics ranged from infrastructure upgrades, not that sexy, but very important. They discussed relocating buildings along the waterfront, as well as plans to create a living shoreline in the city's park. I'll also point out one of the sessions there that I thought was really interesting was by a professor at UNH, Michael Routhier, who presented on sensor deployments that he's been using, not only along coasts like in Hampton. This actually measures the different groundwater, tide changes, but he's also been employing them in the basements of historic buildings in the sump pump pits, which is a really great way to track salinity, water pressure as well. But it can help you have an indicator of sea level rise based on how your ground pressure is changing, which ultimately will help you predict basement inundation at your property. So this is a really great sensor network that he's deploying down in New Hampshire and further down the East Coast as well. Something to keep an eye on. We also had walking tours to look at drainage projects and cemeteries as well that are close to the water's edge. And finally, KHAW Pacific was a really fascinating conference. Again, similar to Trinidad and Tobago, an island nations, I should say. We had over 21 speakers from across the Pacific Islands and across Hawaii at this conference. And the discussion, again, really pushed us, at least myself at NRF, thinking about architectural heritage, not at the forefront or the focus here, but really thinking about intangible heritage, thinking about indigenous knowledge and how we can work those networks and that practice into our thinking about land management and cultural heritage management, both in the Pacific and in Honolulu. And one of the things we're really most proud about Keeping History Above Water conferences is that we can continue the message and continue the conversation. These are just two past conferences that I like to point out in Nantucket. In 2019, following the Keeping History Above Water conference there, they actually partnered with Envision Resilience to host another workshop around protecting cultural heritage from rising seas. And this led to a further collaboration between the Park Service, the Nantucket Historical Society, and ICRM to continue to do assessments on the island of heritage. I think ICRM's actually there this very month doing more work. And also in Salem, the Keeping History Above Water conference in 2021 led to a partnership, the Salem Preservation Partners, who have continued to host yearly workshops about how climate change affects historic resources in Salem and Massachusetts. And I urge you, that's a really great workshop to go visit every year as well up in Salem. And these are the kinds of things we like to see. We don't want to, come in, co-host a community conversation as important as this and then leave. We really want to be sure that there is momentum that is built through this that can be sustained through the host communities we work with and our partners, and even people who come for a one-day conference, maybe not knowing what to expect, but want to bring that home. I think Climate Conversations here is a great example of that. I'd love to see how you all can build this conversation further here in North Kingstown. But I'm going to bring it back now because I get back and my boss Alyssa, we get back from these conferences, we're charged, we're excited, but we come back to Newport and we realize we still have a lot of work to do. We have a lot of new knowledge, but our problems are still here. We come home and flooding greets us. And I just want to share a few of the things that we're working on here in Newport and with the Newport Restoration Foundation to continue to protect our portfolio of vulnerable properties. I mentioned that we know about 32 of our properties are or will be within the flood zone. And this was due to a 2020 vulnerability study that we undertook to really understand the risk posed to our properties and to inform our neighbors about the risks posed to them as well. This study looked at two different things. It first considered a property's exposure. So it's basically where you are physically located on a map. Are you in the FEMA flood zone or not? But more than that, think about your property's location and its elevation. These are images of two NRF properties in the Point neighborhood. The one on the right, as you can see, is very firmly on the ground there. Its first floor is much more subject to flood than the property in the middle there, which you can see has actually been elevated slightly when it was relocated in the 60s. And although its basement is vulnerable and its first floor, it would take a much larger storm event to flood the first floor of the house in the middle. So we have properties that are on a bit of a different timeline in terms of their exposure. And you can see this graphic on the bottom actually shows Bridge Street, another street I mentioned earlier, which is actually at a bit of a lean. It dips downwards. So even these properties here, some of which have been elevated, some of which have not, have different relative first floor flooding heights based on where their elevations are. In addition to exposure, we also looked at sensitivity, which really is the exterior condition of our properties, the envelope of your building. If your foundation is in poor condition, that could be an indicator of how water enters your basements. Sump pumps, again, not exciting stuff, but if your sump pump fails, that's how we've had basements flood in the past. So it's really a first line of defense is to keep your sumps clean. And then also the condition of utilities. Are utilities directly on the ground? Have they been elevated slightly or moved? All of these things kind of go into a score of your building's vulnerability and what steps you still need to take in order to protect it. So we've been doing a lot of data collection at NRF, but some of the things we continue to look for is we monitor our properties post-storm in order to plan how we want to adapt these properties in the future to sea level rise. So We poll our tenants now after every storm event, which they love, and we like to ask them, did you see water on your street? Did you see water in the basement? How much water? Where did the water come from? It's a lot of questions about water, but this is really important data to us because those people, they live in the buildings, they're on the front line to get us this information. And to understand a property that might have water on the street in front of it, a foot of water, but sometimes those basements are dry, and we're trying to keep track of how quickly flooding is going to affect these properties. Additionally, insurance, not the most sexy thing, but we've actually upped our insurance coverage as well and advised our tenants to do the same. So not only the structure is secure and safe, but that also any tenant belongings, hopefully not left in the basement, are also protected and insured. As I mentioned, we're still working on our data collection, mostly because we know that the solution and adaptation for one of our properties, one of these 32 properties, is not going to be the same solution for another property. There certainly will be similarities, but not all the same. So some of the information we're collecting in order to help make a decision of what we want to do next is how water enters your property. We want to know how often a building is flooding as well. Some properties see a trickle, some see quite a bit more of water. We want to know if your sump pumps are running. That's your first line of defense. We also want to be tracking our humidity a lot more in these basements. These are historic properties. They have really old timbers, either groundwater rise or sea level inundation, and the salts from that can cause a lot of damage as well as increased bug activity in your basements. We also are looking into more green land solutions that we can do. I think the speaker next week is going to talk more to things that you can do in your own yard, but more ways to actually shed water away from properties too. And finally, we're always looking to see what the city's doing, if they're doing wastewater upgrades, tidal gates at the end of Storer Park, and what our neighbors are doing, because these are the things that directly affect you. Your neighbors affect you, and if our neighbors are regrading their whole yard, that might be sending water flooding into one of our basements. So these things really need to be done in tandem and in conversation with each other. And finally, as well, our infrastructure and our systems. In New England, most of us have our utilities in our basements, understandably. We have basement space. Nobody wants to hear your boiler running. But these systems are now on front of the line. They're also some of the most expensive things in our homes, but they're the ones most at risk right now to sea level rise and inundation. We're looking into ways we can fortify our systems in basements, if we need to be elevating our systems out of basements as well, what type of review that might need. Majority of our properties are located in the historic district. Any exterior alterations like a shed to house utilities needs approval. But also rethinking what a basement use is. Historically, basements have always been used in New England, but as time goes on, we might begin to lose these spaces, and we need to have conversations about how that changes your tenancy and your livability when your basement space is going to be removed. I'll also just briefly mention as well, at Rough Point, our museum, we also talk about sustainability, and we bring the KHAW message there too. Over the last couple of years, we've had a very major water infiltration project at Rough Point, which is our public-facing museum site. We've had the roof replaced, but we also have recognized that further storms and increased storms over the next few years are only going to pose more of a danger to this building, as elevated as it is. Storms certainly made worse by the effects of climate change. We've upsized our gutter systems, we've added additional downspouts onto the building, and we've worked resiliency and sustainability planning into our capital planning needs for the property as well. We also actively use Rough Point for an interpretive message to talk about keeping history above water. We get a lot of visitors to Newport who know nothing about NRF and certainly less about our properties. They might not be visiting to talk about climate change, but we ensure that while they're there, we talk about the projects that we're working on. We talk about the adaptations needed to protect historic structures going into the future. And yes, we talk about climate change. And the final thing I just want to note, another way that we really are able to elevate preservation best practice in the city of Newport is through partnerships. One of the greatest partnerships that our organization has been able to have is with the city of Newport and with the Newport Historic District Commission, which are really forward-thinking players and partners. They think actively about climate change and how it will affect historic buildings, not only sea level rise, but also changing climates, alternate materials, and different ways we need to be thinking about the sustainability of our buildings in the future. One of those responses in Newport has been building elevation. You can see here, this is a street in the point. 2 of those buildings in this photograph have been elevated over the last 10 to 15 years. And I will say that this is very much keeping in line with other historic communities around the country, such as Nantucket and Charleston, who have also adopted building elevation as a tool or a method for building preservation. It's not the right tool for everyone, but it's certainly a mode that is being adopted here in Newport. In 2020, the Newport HDC created the design guidelines for elevating historic buildings. This is one of the first of these design guidelines created in the country, so we're really proud that it was done here in Newport and around colonial architecture, which again looked at different types of considerations and adaptations that would be necessary to take a colonial building, to raise it up, and to still make it fit into its historic streetscape character and its surrounding buildings. NRF really served as a key player in this regard, reviewing drafts of this process and working closely with the HDC, but we also partnered with the HDC to make a graphical version of these standards, because a typical homeowner might hear the word elevation and just think of a coastal North Carolina property up on stilts on the water, and that is of course not what we wanted to do here in Newport, and we knew that visualizations would be key. I mentioned buildings are already being elevated in Newport, some I'll say aesthetically better than others, although it is great to see people actively working to preserve their properties. And we've also seen that the picture in the center there of Bridge Street with that house circled, some homes in Newport following the Great Hurricane in the 30s actually were already slightly elevated in the past. This map shows that this building, this small Newport cottage, used to be on the street, but at some point in time, before we have record of building permits, had actually been moved back and slightly elevated. So we know that this has been an ethos and a thinking already in Newport for some time, and we really wanted to work with the city to ensure that elevated homes would continue to meet the great streetscape character and contribute to the economic development of why people love coming to Newport. You'll also see that there has been new construction in the Point neighborhood. These 2 buildings were constructed. They're almost done. The finishing touches are going on as we speak. Without guidance. There were no design guidelines when these buildings were built, which is probably why there's garages on the first level, which you probably don't want to park your car in a flooded garage. But so we knew the need was there for these design guidelines. We partnered with the city and were able to produce them just last year. We're really proud of these. There's a link on our website if you want to look through. It's quite a large document, but it provides really great oversight to building elevation standards nationwide, kind of where Newport and Rhode Island fit within those standards, what the FEMA standards for building elevation are, and the current flood zone. One thing that we really wanted to ensure is that these graphics included graphics of buildings being elevated. One thing we've heard from homeowners is that they're concerned about their property rates changing based on, if my neighbor's building is elevated yay high and mine's yay low, how is that going to change the streetscape character? How is that going to change my own enjoyment and visitation of my site and my home? So we were able to provide different streetscapes to show over time how elevations, if done uniformly across many years, of course, this could be achieved and create a level of consistency in a neighborhood. Most buildings in Newport that we're seeing now have been elevated either to 4 feet to 7 feet, some to 9 feet. It's based on their location in the FEMA flood zone. We also included commercial considerations. There's a number of properties, even not in the historic district, who could look to this guideline along Thames Street, which has been flooding recently. Ways to put in shields to protect your doors and entries from flooding events, but also ways to elevate your first floor so that your streetscape doesn't change visually, but when you enter a store, from this graphic on the right, you can see there are ways to enter the store but keep flooding out. So these are things we worked into the guidelines as well to give people a visual way to understand this information. And we also included landscape guidance as well, ways, permeable pavers, and floodable plant life. That's not the words I wanted to use. Natural plants could really help to alleviate flooding at a site level as well. And what you can see here, these are some buildings currently in Newport being elevated or soon to be elevated that are following the Newport design guidelines. So this building here, Pitt's Head Tavern on the right, is currently up in the air. You can still drive down Bridge Street and see it that way today, but this building has followed all guidelines according to the Newport Historic District. It's going to have a beautiful stone veneer placed on its foundation, and we're just seeing more and more applications come forward now with guidance for how to adapt these structures for the future. And I'll finally just end back where we started with 74 Bridge Street. NRF made the decision in 2020 to sell the building with a preservation easement in place, which would protect its exterior indefinitely. And it was sold to homeowners who we knew intended to elevate the structure, which we agreed was the correct adaptation solution for this property at the time, and they did, as you can see, elevate the building. This was actually the first property that followed the Newport design standards for elevating historic buildings, and we were really great to have worked closely with the HDC on this process, and I think created a very attainable solution here for one of these buildings in the flood zone. That's what I wanted to share with you all today, a little bit about keeping history above water. I'd be happy to answer any questions. I'd be happy to think about ways we can bring this conversation more here home in Rhode Island. And thank you.
So when you do the kind of project that the homeowners did at 74 Bridge Street to raise the property, is that a practical solution for many homeowners? What are we talking about as the financial implication of doing something like that? You can do anything as a special project or a test, but can it be made a part of a strategy on a large scale?
It's a great question. You're not the first person to ask about the finances of elevating a home. I will be honest, I don't have specific numbers that I can offer specifically for that project or others. It's an expensive endeavor to elevate a home, particularly a historic home. One of the properties I just showed you, Pitt's Head Tavern on Bridge Street, they elevated the property and found a significant amount of sill damage that also had to be addressed. These homes are maybe not intended to go vertically before they can be restored. But in terms of what is a correct adaptation, relocating a building, I would argue, is probably even more expensive than elevating a building and placing it on a new foundation. If we leave these properties where they are, they will flood in the future, and they won't be here any longer. They'll slowly break down. So I think elevation is one solution that folks are using. We're also seeing people in the district that have implemented flood vents on the side of their foundations as well. I mentioned earlier there's flood proofing where you can keep water out, but there's also fortify your foundation, but you can also wet proof, which allows water through. So we've seen some examples of that too. But it's an expensive endeavor, absolutely.
Scale of magnitude, if I gave you a 2, how many zeros are we talking about after the 2?
3 or 4 probably after a 2. Math.
6, 2 million?
4. I would say 4. Depending on the size of the building.
Okay, thank you.
I was thinking 5 figures. You think it's 6 figures? I think it depends on the... Okay. We could talk later. Yes.
I'm assuming the person who buys that property is buying a property owned by a trust. Is that part of the...
We no longer own that building, so we did, to a private homeowner.
Assuming he's extremely wealthy and can afford to do this kind of stuff. Is that a fair...
In the Point neighborhood used to be a much more middle-class neighborhood. Times have changed. I would argue a lot of Newport is going that direction. It's become a very affluent neighborhood. But not all homeowners in the Point can afford to elevate their buildings by any means. There is a requirement now in practice, if you purchase a building that's in the flood zone and you invest more than 50% of the building's value, you need to elevate that building to take it out of the flood zone, which if you're putting enough money into renovating a property, some people do hit that number pretty quickly, not everyone, but we are seeing it as a solution. I'll also note that there are a lot of benefits to elevating your building beyond just saving your property. You also dramatically lower your flood insurance. People can pay great numbers. We pay at NRF a lot of money every year in flood insurance to protect our properties because none of them have been elevated, our utilities haven't been elevated, and they're very vulnerable at this point. But were we to elevate a building or elevate utilities, our flood insurance costs will go down dramatically. So there is a payoff value to elevating your home over time. And I'm sorry I don't have those exact numbers. I would like to one day. But I can see why people who have the upfront investment may make that choice.
thank you for a great talk. When you do your surveys, what do people who live in a dry house with a flooded street feel? I mean, what are they saying about living there?
Yeah, we have a really pretty great collection of tenants, I would say. People who, we call them tenant stewards because they're stewards of these properties. They agree when they sign their lease, they sign an additional document, you know, with the understanding that they're living in a historic home and that sometimes even the needs of the home might outweigh their needs as a renter. So we find, generally speaking, our tenants are very responsive. They'll even email us pictures of flooding if there isn't a survey that we've distributed. I wouldn't say there's skepticism about it. Again, I think when you see flooding, you know there's only a matter of time before that's going to begin to affect you in one way or another. But it's certainly a learning curve here in Rhode Island. I think I could say, Alyssa, we've been looking into quotes for elevating our boilers, and we were talking with one of the companies we've been chatting with to gather these quotes, and I said, are other people doing this? And he said, no one has really thought ahead like this. After Sandy, a lot of people were rushing to try to get this work done, but in advance, nobody wants to always make or can't really make that initial investment up front. But I think the numbers speak for themselves, and we know this is the right steps we need to be taking. Yeah.
Obviously, like, climate change is happening kind of a bigger picture, but in Newport, would you say that maybe a lot of the flooding is coming from the lack of green space? Because there has been a lot of development on the island, so obviously it's going to start having different consequences from that. Do you think the lack of green space is a factor?
I wonder about that, and it's not my area of expertise at all, you know, landscape guidance. It's something we've looked into a lot as an organization. Newport is about 90% built out, so you're right. And other than housing, the most sought after thing in Newport is parking. So yes, green space is definitely, especially in the downtown, something that we need more of. With NRF and our about 72 rental properties, most of those properties come with green space, a backyard. Some of them have side yards as well. And we've been thinking actively about how we can utilize those spaces more and I will be at the climate conversation next week about rain gardens and using those spaces better, because it's something we've wanted to dive into more. But again, we have tenants in those spaces who may want a rain garden, may not all want a rain garden. But I think you're right in that we do need to be thinking more, and I'm happy the guidelines included things like impervious pavers and native plantings that we can employ more. It's definitely something we need to be doing more of in the city. But thank you.
I'm wondering, do you have data at all for which of these measures work better than which other ones, like raising it versus wet-proofing and letting it come and go?
Yeah, the question was if there's data about what type of adaptation measure for your home is more, I would say probably significant in the long run and works better. Every property is different, of course. I like to think of things on a timeline as well. We have seen houses elevated along Bridge Street, even some of the ones I showed in these pictures, that actually received variances so that they elevated the building, but they didn't elevate the building to FEMA requirements. You can still do that in the state of Rhode Island. You can apply for a variance when you obtain your elevation certificate. And some homeowners have chosen to do this because it is stark to come home to your house and the front step is actually above your head. I can understand. You can elevate your building maybe just 3 feet or 4 feet, and it's much less, your front door might only be here now. It's much less jarring to a passerby and much less jarring perhaps to you as a homeowner. And we have to think too about folks also, building staircases. Do you need to put a lift into your home? There's a lot of things that go into elevating a property. To your point about timeline, those buildings that have been elevated only 3 or 4 feet and haven't met a FEMA standard, they will be safe from flooding to a certain extent. But if we're looking 50 years down the road, 100 years down the road, unless the city of Newport has built a really crazy high seawall that everybody really hates, I think those buildings might be reconsidering their adaptation choice as sea levels only become higher. Meg.
So has NRF raised any of your buildings, or do you have plans to raise any of your buildings?
We would love to maybe raise it, but I can't. My boss is here, so I can't. I can't say exactly what we would like to do, but we know, as I've hopefully outlined here tonight, that we have a lot of work to do. We're in the data collection phase. We were really happy that we could have worked so closely with the homeowners at 74 Bridge Street for their elevation, so we have a sense of what it takes, what you need in order to do that. I think it's definitely going to be the right solution for some of our properties, maybe not all of them, and it's something we're actively thinking about. Yeah.
You mentioned at the very beginning the importance of including federal people in conferences. How much, or is there, what sort of resources are available, say, to Newport or to Wickford in terms of federal dollars to do some of this work?
For your typical homeowner, there's not a lot of funding right now, unfortunately, but I think that will be changing. I think that will be changing soon. We've already had the Rhode Island CRMC has been working actively with the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. In 2022, they issued a report. It's available online. They surveyed the whole coast of Rhode Island to determine what properties were vulnerable to sea level rise. They ultimately said that non-structural measures, which include things like seawalls and berms, would not be effective in the state of Rhode Island. So the things that will be effective are things like elevating homes and relocating homes and fortifying homes to a certain degree from flooding as well. Since that is now coming directly from the Army Corps, we know that at some point there will be some financial backing for issuing a report like that, but how many years down the road it is, I'm not sure. But we know that that's definitely going to be a focus more in the future. Yeah.
If you raise the house 4 feet, let's say you're on Bridge Street, whatever it is, and all these houses have come up 4 or 5 feet, the road is still going to be flooded.
Yes.
And if the water, let's say, gets to 2 feet, then part of the staircase access to your house is now underwater. So how do you plan with just a house when ultimately you're going to have to be raising the roads and the sidewalks?
Yeah. No, you're absolutely right. I think that's a perfect example of why what one homeowner does is not enough. If every homeowner in the point elevated their property next year together simultaneously, that would be great. But if the city doesn't take action to improve infrastructure, to do some type of fortification of the seawall in Newport, if they don't, if the federal government doesn't provide funds to help continue to give projects, we've had some great resiliency efforts in Kings Park in Newport and other areas. If that type of work doesn't continue along with the steps that homeowners are taking, this isn't going to work. We all need to be doing steps at the same time, really, in order to make these places more sustainable in the future. But you're right. Currently, you can go to Bridge Street after it's flooded, and there's a couple of inches of water, and you can still access your home, but you might want to move your car if it got worse than that, certainly. But this is a slow process, and I think, to your point about funding, until funding is made available to the everyday person to do this, I don't think things are going to move too fast. So funding is definitely a key piece of this. Go ahead.
So, is there any interest in trying to make your homes more energy efficient and less use mitigation?
Yes, I would say yes. NRF's actually undertaking an energy efficiency study now, although it is not for a property in the flood zone. We figured one thing at a time. Energy efficiency is a great way to improve your greenhouse gas outtake. It's a great way to improve your bills every month as well, and to make your property more sustainable for the long term. I don't know how it will affect your flood potential necessarily, other than doing, landscaping efforts around your building to collect rainwater or to dispel water away from your property. We've been working at NRF to try to kind of marry the two in some way, because as we make adaptations to our buildings, like potentially elevating our utilities in the future out of these wet basement spaces. Well, hey, if we're replacing a boiler, maybe we should be switching to electric. Maybe we should be thinking about mini split systems. So I think as you're doing this type of planning at a site level at your property, there are other certainly greener techniques you can be employing when you're replacing or when you're adapting. And I'd like to think that mechanicals are a great way to first approach that.
I read quite a bit about new materials that, like nanomaterials and ceramics that they're using for flotation devices. So in the future, I think you could build houses on flotation devices. All you need is a pump to put air in.
Yeah. We had a really great design charrette that was done by RISD students, right? Yeah, it was RISD students, Alyssa, in I think 2017 or 2018, all around the Point neighborhood and around 74 Bridge Street. And that was certainly a consideration. The Park Service does some really great exercises in flood management. And that was one of them. They said, let's try to figure out the costs of maybe doing that. So it's been, I was going to say it's been floated, but it's been thought about for sure. But then we're thinking costs again, and what's the long-term payback for something like that? Maybe the federal government could pay for it, but
it's like a water world transition.
Yes.
We're living on the water.
Yeah.
Traveling around by boats.
But we do, I think, to the point earlier about if our street's flooded, how do you get to your house? I think we need to be thinking the new normal is not what we see today. And a lot of people, even in the Point neighborhood, who walk by these elevated homes every day, some people are upset by them. And I understand, because visually it's a big change. But I think there's going to be things that need to change, even in historic districts that are always, we're not going to change. But I think in this case, we preservationists have been pretty forward thinking in terms of we need to allow change, but how can we do it sensitively? Yeah.
Yeah, so you seem to be working on a site basis, in each house by house. So how much interaction do you have with the city of Newport, the Newport County, or actually the state of Rhode Island in terms of, putting all this into some larger plan?
Yeah. So we're a small nonprofit, but we like to think that our power is through our properties, because we have a lot of them. And we really think that, unlike a single homeowner in the Point who maybe can't go and rah-rah and say, this is upsetting to me, I'm concerned about what to do with my property. Well, we have 72 properties, so we can be a much more powerful player, we like to think, in that. We have a good relationship with the city. I will say that the city of Newport just hired actually Teresa Green, who was the first speaker at this climate conversations, to be our new director of resiliency. I think she's either just started or is about to start. So I'm hoping that we can have a great conversation with her. We like to try to be active as well on Aquidneck Island-wide groups as well about how we can do sustainability. We like to share what we're doing at conversations like tonight as well. But we'd like to certainly be more involved in that as well on the state level. But we like to think that KHAW is one of those tools that we have to not only do it in Newport, but also go to other places and encourage neighborhoods to speak out. Yeah.
Thank you.
You talk after.
So I'm Meg Kerr. I'm one of the people that has organized these lectures and the photo exhibit. And I end each one of these reminding you that there's climate trivia on October 16th at 6:30 at West Passage Brewery. And because you all have been to these lectures, you're going to knock it out of the park with the trivia. So hope to see you there. And next week's lecture, as Margaret said, is on what we can do around our home. So we hope to see you there. Oh, and if you have any comments or thoughts, we have the clipboards. We're very open. We're just a group of people that are interested and concerned about climate change and working together as a community to address it. So add your great ideas to our clipboards and we'll take a look at them and get in touch with you. So thank you for coming.